Let's jump straight into my first tip for you. To start us off, I'm telling you to stop. And I'm not talking about that detail phase where all you want to do is keep adding dust and birds and little things in the background. I'm talking about knowing your boundaries and being able to step away from a painting when you're starting to get frustrated. As artists, we're going to be expected to sit in front of a painting for hours on end until it's finished. And that takes a lot of patience, especially if you're building up to be an artist who spends hours a day on a painting for months on end. Annoyingly so, it takes patience to build patience, as unfortunately, it's not something that you just acquire overnight, even if you have been the sort of artist to spend hours a day on a painting before. Burnout is a very common term in the artist community, and it's not uncommon for many artists to frequently fall into it. I know personally that burnouts can last for months or even years at a time, and typically they're caused by frustration because you can't paint what you want to paint, or by generally not being able to come up with many ideas. While I have also found the upside to burnouts, as I focus on other hobbies in that time, which then puts more inspiration into my art, burnout is something we want to avoid as artists. We lose our creative spark a little. So, by knowing your boundaries and knowing when to stop and take a step back, have a sip of not paint water, you will prevent, hopefully, a lot of burnout, which will keep you going for a lot longer and keep you on that creative path. But how do you know when to stop? How do you know when to take a step back? You're going to have to learn to listen to yourself, your body, your mind, your thoughts. If you're feeling uncomfortable, it's a sign that you need to take a break. If you're feeling unsure of what to do next, that's also another sign. Sometimes you'll also just feel it in your intuition that you're not liking the painting. I often find that's a sign that I need to take a break and consider if I want to continue the painting. Know that you are allowed to start new paintings if one is frustrating you. Don't get me wrong, it's good to push through your comfort zone and paint something new. However, if this is leaving you frustrated enough that you don't want to paint again for the next week or two, you need to stop. Like I said, go have a drink, go have a sit down, have a think about whether you really want to continue this painting. Maybe do a few sketches or completely turn your art brain off and come back to it tomorrow. Then, when you switch your brain back on again, you might realize that actually you can do this, you can finish it, or you'll have another idea and think it's time to start something new. You are okay to start something new. Whether you're a digital artist, an oil painter, watercolor, or just drawing, this tip applies no matter what sort of artist you are. You may even be a sculptor. The next tip or skill I have to share with you would have to be experimenting. I find it goes nicely in hand with knowing when to stop because you can do experiments during your break time. Sometimes they'll reignite the fire that you had lost to the frustration of sitting on the same piece for hours. Now, you may not think scientists and artists have that huge thing in common, but experimenting is an artist's bread and butter as well. Whether it's with a new medium, a new style, or just trying something out of your comfort zone, like a background or dynamic posing. Experiments are where an artist gets to let loose and also expand their comfort zone, making them improve at the same time. Often, a lot of artists start out in an experimental phase, and I think that's where a lot of newer artists get confused about finding a style, because every new piece to you is an experiment whether or not you realize it. So, holding off on finding a style isn't actually a bad thing. You're giving yourself a lot more time to experiment and try out new things, which will just make you better in the long run. And finding your own style as an artist shouldn't be your end goal. I'm sure you've probably seen many established artists have consistent styles for years on end. And this is not me bashing them, I look up to a lot of them myself. But a lot of what makes their style so consistent is them finding what they really, really enjoy and sticking with it. And you're just not going to find what you really enjoy if you don't try out a billion different things first. There's also room for your tastes to change. Maybe today you like sketching with pencil, tomorrow you might prefer to use gouache. You don't have to stick to a style once you have found it. You can also just have multiple styles and find yourself dancing between a few that you really enjoy. As for how you experiment, you can think of something new you want to try, like I said earlier. Let's say, for example, my experiment is trying out some dynamic poses. I'm going to start by finding a reference that really sparks joy in me and I like to look at, and also consider if I think I'm going to be good at replicating it. By starting off on such a positive note, it's going to encourage me to do a few more experiments after. Like this pose and this pose, which honestly I wasn't looking forward to, but I went for it after how good the first one went. Maybe I would get that same positive emotion at the end. Now that I've done the experiment, I can consider what went well, what I would try again, and whether or not I want to finish something to put into a piece. I'm actually so happy with how this one came out specifically. I think it's going to affect my next work a lot. Now, of course, you don't have to think this structured when doing your own experiments. The thinking definitely becomes more fluid and natural the more you do. So think of it less as an assignment and just go for it. Before I jump into possibly the last two most important tips I can share with you, I'm going to talk a bit about this one. Being able to digest critique. Critique is something faced a lot as an artist. You do need to know your boundaries to know whether or not you're going to accept all critique, because some of it genuinely is just not wanted and not needed because it's about something that you deliberately made look that way. This is where being firm in your boundaries and understanding yourself and being able to value your own opinion more than someone else's is really important. But to some degree, you also need to be able to embrace change and embrace not being perfect. You need to learn to become more understanding and work through usual defensive feelings when faced with criticism. That way, you can skip straight to just improving. So, like I said, this doesn't mean accepting any and all critique. Often we will be given unrequested critique when posting anywhere on social media, and it stings a lot, and you're allowed to feel that. You'll know the nuances in your decisions a lot more than some stranger on the internet. So, while accepting it is really important, also rejecting it will make your work more yours. If you are someone who gets your feelings frequently hurt and struggles to accept criticism, hi, I'm one of you, here's how you can work on that. Start by looking at your own work, an older piece maybe, and think constructively. Don't just say it's bad. Name one thing you like and then one thing you could have done better. Think about why and how you could make it better in your next painting. I want you to think about it from a third person's perspective if you can. Remove the attachment you have to your work and just look at it for what it is in front of you. Get reattached as a consumer. Think about the story the artist may have intended behind it, whether or not that's really what you meant. If you struggle with doing this, maybe you should ask a friend or a relative for advice on your current work. You might not always have a friend or relative around though, and you can work on being your own best critic. I don't know if this is a thing anyone else has started yet, but I think we should have something in the art community called soft criticism, where you ask for it and receive one compliment and then one softly worded critique. To give you an example of soft critique, this is my own painting, and I think the pose is gorgeous. I love the pose, I love the blue stars. However, it's a little boring because the colours are all very samey, and I think it could have some extra pizzazz by having another subject in there. I think it would really improve the visual interest and storytelling of this piece. If you'd like some soft critique on your own work, I'm sure you can just ask anywhere on social media and tag me in the video. I would love to give you some. The last two tips are very important and possibly obvious. At least one of them was drilled into me from a very young age, and that one would be observation. Learning to really dissect and observe everything around you can be very tasking, and it can also leave you very overwhelmed. Nonetheless, it is something you should aim to work on as an artist, as it's something you'll use every day, whether you're observing references, your own art, or someone else's. By learning to look more in depth at everything from the world around you to references, you can really dissect and digest everything. Being told to use a reference is great and all, but how do you actually consume that in a way that improves your art? You need to start by learning how to dissect the larger shapes, what makes things compose nicely, the perspective maybe. You're allowed to physically trace this for practice sake. Then you might perhaps move on to the smaller details about a reference, how textures work, how creases form, different things that just build the piece up to be what it is. But at a first glance, there is so much information in a reference that you just don't quite know how to consume. It's easy to get really caught up on the details. I find that observation is actually a really easy skill to build. It's actually a lot less effort than some of the other things I've previously mentioned. You can actually work on this skill right now. Let's say you're in bed. Have a look around you. Where do your walls meet? Do you have a desk that's going perpendicular to the floor? Pay attention to these planes and focus on just the planes for a moment. You'll find a lot of things run parallel or perpendicular to each other. Think about how you would construct this as a sketch. Then we can move on to other things like the texture of your duvet, the texture on the top of a desk, the lighting pouring in through the window. Think about how you would translate that. Would the duvet be loads of little dots to show that it's soft and patterned and has depth? Maybe the desk would be crosshatched because it's flat and straight, and maybe there's a wood grain. Then the lighting you could consider leaving negative space for. Maybe you're going to fill in everything else in the drawing apart from where the light hits. This is something you can do with just you and the world around you. You don't need any pencils or paper. Just think about how you would translate everything in front of you if it was a drawing. It will also help a lot with building speed in your work. And if speed is something you really want to work on, then this tip is for you: muscle memory. So when you think muscle memory, you're probably thinking of catching a ball with just your reflexes. Now, that's not quite how it works in art, but muscle memory does translate. A lot of muscle memory in art is about being really familiar with your tools, because in a way they are an extension of your own arm. Therefore, you need to understand them as well as you do your own arm. You can work on getting familiar with your own tools by 1, choosing to stick to one for a little bit, and 2, doing a bunch of squiggles and tracing and just general drawing. It will help you get a feel for what's right in a painting and allow you to go more into autopilot, because you know if you put this much pressure on the brush, exactly what's going to happen. Don't expect to fall completely asleep whilst your arm does all the work though. This goes hand in hand with observation because your brain can work on observing everything, observing the next moves maybe, and then your hand just has to follow through. Muscle memory can also be even more niche. For example, let's say you draw a bunch of dogs. Pretty quickly, you're going to realize you don't need to use references as often because a lot of the planes work the same, whether or not you realize it in your head. General pattern recognition and your hand will work together to figure out that this plane typically always follows this plane. Now, it's probably going to take you years and years to get to this level of muscle memory on every single thing you could possibly ever want to draw. However, the option is on the table for you, if you can enjoy it enough to want to commit to it anyway. Don't forget to use your references when learning muscle memory because you don't want to be learning the same thing over and over incorrectly. And that was my last tip for you. Thank you for watching. If you liked what I was working on, it's available as a print in my shop linked below.